First, we have to place all of our tools that we plan to use in the melted wax to warm up. The wax should never be bubbling, so please let me know if it is, and I will adjust the temperature. When using any metal items as stamps, please make sure it has an appropriate handle for use, otherwise it could get too hot to hold. Place your muslin on top of the newspaper. When using any chops or other utensils, make sure to pause and allow for it to drip before pressing it onto your piece. Then remove it and place it back into the wax. It is always important to check that your wax has saturated through the muslin. The wax is the resist, so if it looks like it's just sitting on the surface, it probably is. You can see by the way this chop prints, I could have allowed for more wax to drip or not pressed so hard. It will take practice to get the right amount of wax to transfer. Okay. Continue to check for saturation as you work. You will find that some tools work better than others, and that is why I want you to do a test batik. This tool did not leave behind the entire shape and was not fully saturated. When using the chanting tools, you always need to have a drip catch. A piece of cardboard will work for this. Carefully remove the chanting needle from the wax and immediately place it onto the cardboard and move to your piece. You have to move fairly quickly because the wax continues to run out of the opening and will gradually cool. But we need hot wax to get a good saturation. You can see with this second line I created, the earlier stage in the zigzag was saturated, but near the end it was not nearly as hot, so it did not penetrate through the fabric. When removing tools from the wax, always lay them on their side so they don't get stuck to the newspaper. This is an example of using just the chanting tool to draw. I chose to draw several monstera leaves in this piece. And remember to check for saturation as you work. If it did not penetrate the fabric, then you can either turn it over and try to saturate it from that side or simply redraw the line. I know that it's difficult to freehand designs, but it's part of the freedom that batik has to offer. Try to let go of creating a structured design and just go for it. It is helpful to continue to separate your piece from the newspaper as you work because it will stick to it. So this piece would count as one of my batik pieces that require the chanting tool. This piece is to show the repeated use of tools to create a pattern, which is also one of your required pieces to create. And this example is to show how you can combine the use of found objects and the chanting tools. If you have something specific in mind, it's good to take a moment to visualize where things will be placed, but don't get frustrated if it doesn't turn out exactly how you envisioned. Just go with it. Next step, after the wax is cooled, is to either hand paint with the Dynaflow dyes or dip into the vat of dye for a solid color. Before opening the containers, make sure the lid is on tight and shake it up. We're going to use pipettes to transfer the dye to the paint palette. This can be reused, so please don't throw away the pipettes. Very important. Always, always, always keep the dye away from the edge of the table or your elbows. Try and place it directly in front of you or on the other side of your piece. If you're mixing colors, remember to start with the lighter color and only add just a little bit of the darker color at a time. As you use the dyes, you will need to mix them periodically in the palette as it will begin to settle. You'll notice that when you apply the dyes to fabric, it's similar to using watercolor. But remember, that means you can easily apply too much color and it will bleed on the fabric, and then you'll have colors bleeding into each other, which is nice when it's intentional, but when you're trying to have a crisp line, that defeats the purpose. We will use lots of paintbrushes, so please make sure to clean them immediately after you use them so they're available for other people to use. Keep in mind, from painting one area to the next, like the leaves, and then when I move on to the background, you really want to make sure that that first section is dry before moving on to the background, because all of those colors could bleed together. You'll see that a little bit more obvious on my sunflower piece later on. I got a little too anxious and excited, so I painted a little bit too soon. As you can see, when I paint this background, I started by applying the lighter color at the beginning and then painted the darker color on top. If I wanted to make this light blue background area a solid color without having to hand paint it, I would go back to the wax, once my dye was dry, of course, and fill in the areas that I don't want to dye. So like I'm covering up all of the floral areas with wax, and you'll want to do that on the front side, and once that front is cool, you would turn it over and do the back side. You can do that with the chanting tools or a brush. Then once that wax is cool, I would dip it into the vat of dye. Once you've completed the dyeing, then cover the piece front and back with wax, and obviously waiting in between layers of front to back to allow the front to dry before moving to the back side. If you don't do this, you'll end up having a halo around all of your previous lines that you applied with the wax, which is not horrible, but it doesn't give it quite as contrast of a look. Once it's cooled completely, it's ready to be cracked. So if you want to create a crackle pattern effect, this is the time in which you will crack the wax. I was pretty conservative with the amount of crackle that I applied. Just remember, it's always best to start with less cracks in your piece because you can always add more later, but you can't take away the cracks once they're made. Then outside, you will dunk your piece in the color of your choosing. This is a navy blue, and the other color is a scarlet red. It's helpful to stir the dye periodically, especially when there are pieces soaking. So every now and then you can have someone go outside and use the wooden stick to stir it around. And you just want to make sure that your pieces are fully submerged. You know, you don't want to leave half of it sitting outside of the dye because half of it won't dye quite as strong as the other. And it's okay if you see wax flaking off in the dye. That won't matter, that won't affect anything. It's just bound to happen. After about 30 minutes, I checked on my pieces and the progress of the dyeing process. It doesn't show it in this video because I needed 2 hands to do this, but I put on gloves and removed both pieces to add more crackle. So I just took it out of the dye and moved it around more just to add more cracks. The dye buckets don't need to be covered, but I tried to keep some of the heat in the bucket since it was so cold outside on this day. After a total of 2 hours, I removed my pieces from the dye, laid them out. You can hang them up, like we might have a line to hang up our batik pieces, or we can lay them in the grass. Once they're somewhat dry, then you can go over to a trash can and remove some of the chunks of wax that are easy to pull off, because that means less ironing later on. Then you'll want to lay your batik on top of several pieces of newspaper, place a single layer on top, and begin to rub and move the iron over the newspaper until it has been saturated with wax. This process can take a long time, so consider that when you apply that encasing layer of wax. Too much wax means more work later, but you do want to make sure you have your piece sealed well enough. Once that piece of newspaper is saturated, remove it and use a new one. Repeat this until the batik is flexible when cool. There will still be a small amount of wax left in the piece when you're done, and that's okay. If we really wanted to fully remove the wax, we would have to boil it out like the other videos demonstrated. But here it is.